Welcome back to our channel, where we journey through the forgotten chapters of human history. Tonight, we read traveling back over 4,000 years to explore one of the most magnificent and mysterious civilizations that ever existed, the lost kingdom of Babylon. Picture this. You're standing at the gates of the ancient world's most powerful city. Before you rise the legendary Ishtar Gate, its brilliant blue tiles gleaming with golden dragons and bulls. Behind these massive walls lies a kingdom that gave birth to the world's first written laws, where astronomers mapped the heavens and where the legendary hanging gardens once defied gravity itself. But how did a small trading post on the Euphrates River grow to become the center of the known world? How did kings like Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar build an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea? And why did this mighty civilization, which seemed destined to rule forever, ultimately vanish into the sands of time? Tonight, we'll uncover the complete story of Babylon from its humble beginnings around 1894 BCE to its final fall in 539 BCE. We'll explore the rise of Hammurabi the lawgiver, the mysteries surrounding the Tower of Babel, the glory days of Nebuchadnezzar, and the dramatic circumstances that led to the kingdom's ultimate demise. This is the epic tale of ambition, power, divine judgment, and human achievement. This is the story of the lost kingdom of Babylon. Let the journey begin. Chapter 1. From Dust and Water. The year is 1894 BCE, along the fertile banks of the Euphrates River, where the muddy waters carry life through an otherwise unforgiving desert. A group of nomadic people called the Amorites are about to change the course of human history. They've just conquered a small, unremarkable trading post called Babylon, a name that means Gate of the Gods. You can imagine the scene. Dusty tent cities giving way to mud brick walls, the sound of hammers and chisels as workers shape the first permanent structures, the calls of merchants from distant lands bringing exotic goods to this strategic crossroads. But none of these early settlers could have imagined that their modest settlement would one day become the most powerful city on earth. To understand Babylon's rise, we must first understand the world it was born into. This is ancient Mesopotamia, literally the land between rivers, where the Tigris and Euphrates flow toward the Persian Gulf through what is now modern Iraq. For over 1,000 years before Babylon's founding, this region had been the heartland of human civilization. The Sumerians had already given the world writing, the wheel, and the first cities. Their successors, the Akkadians, had created the world's first empire under the legendary Sargon. But by the time the Amorites arrived, these great powers were fading memories. The land was fragmented into competing city-states, each struggling for survival and supremacy. The Amorites were something different, a Semitic people from the western deserts who brought with them a fierce warrior culture and an adaptability that would serve them well in the complex world of Mesopotamian politics. Unlike the previous inhabitants who had deep roots in the region, the Amorites were outsiders who could see opportunities that others missed. Under their first king, Sennacherib, Babylon was nothing special, just one of many small kingdoms fighting for scraps. The city controlled little more than the area immediately around its walls, along with a few nearby towns like Dilbat, Sippar, Kish, and Borsippa. Mighty neighbors like Assyria to the north, Elam to the east, and the powerful city-states of Isin and Larsa to the south dwarfed this fledgling kingdom. But the Amorites possessed something their predecessors lacked: patience and strategic thinking. They understood that in Mesopotamia, survival meant more than military might. It required diplomacy, trade, and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. While other kingdoms exhausted themselves in endless warfare, the early Babylonian kings quietly built their strength. The first 5 kings of Babylon, Samuilbum, Samalilam, Sabum, Apolsin, and Sinmabalit, may not have conquered vast territories, but they established something more valuable: stability. They created a bureaucracy, established trade relationships, and began the careful work of turning a collection of tribes into a unified people. During these early years, Babylon's location became its greatest asset. The city sat at the intersection of major trade routes, connecting the resource-rich mountains of Anatolia and Iran with the wealthy cities of southern Mesopotamia. Merchants traveling between Assyria and the Persian Gulf found Babylon to be the perfect stopping point, safe, well-governed, and strategically positioned. The early Babylonian kings were also shrewd observers of the religious landscape. They understood that in Mesopotamia, political power and religious authority were inseparable. While they initially honored the traditional gods of the region, particularly Enlil of Nippur, they slowly began promoting their own patron deity, Marduk, as a god worthy of respect and veneration. This period also saw the development of what would become Babylonian culture. The Amorites adopted the Akkadian language for official business, while preserving Sumerian for religious texts, a decision that connected them to the region's ancient traditions while establishing their own identity. They embraced the cuneiform writing system and began creating their own literature, blending Amorite oral traditions with Mesopotamian literary forms. The city itself during this period was modest but growing. Archaeological evidence suggests that early Babylon was built on both sides of the Euphrates, connected by bridges. The settlement featured the typical Mesopotamian urban layout, a central temple complex surrounded by residential quarters, marketplaces, and workshops. The famous walls that would later inspire wonder throughout the ancient world were still in their infancy, simple mud brick fortifications designed more to deter raiders than to withstand major sieges. Perhaps most importantly, these early kings established the principle that would guide Babylon throughout its history: the idea that true power came not from conquest alone, but from creating a civilization so attractive that others would want to join it. They welcomed foreign merchants, skilled craftsmen, and learned scribes. They created laws that protected trade and established courts that provided justice fairly. By the end of Sinmabalat's reign in 1792 BCE, Babylon had grown from a dusty trading post into a respectable regional power. The city's population had swelled with immigrants from across Mesopotamia. Its markets buzzed with activity as goods from across the known world changed hands. Its temples had become centers of learning, where scribes preserved and copied the wisdom of ages past. But Babylon was still just one kingdom among many, still vulnerable to more powerful neighbors, still dependent on alliances and diplomacy for survival. What happened next would transform this modest city-state into the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. And it all began with the rise of a young prince named Hammurabi, whose vision would reshape not just Babylon, but the very concept of civilization itself. The stage was set for greatness. The foundations had been laid. All that remained was for history to provide the right leader at the right moment. Chapter 2. The Rise of Hammurabi in 1792 BCE. A young man named Hammurabi ascended to the throne of Babylon as its sixth king. He inherited a small kingdom that controlled perhaps a dozen cities and constantly lived in the shadow of more powerful neighbors. When he died 42 years later, he ruled an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to northern Syria, and his name would echo through history as one of humanity's first great lawgivers. But Hammurabi's rise to power was anything but inevitable. You can imagine the young king looking out from his palace windows at a world filled with threats and opportunities. To the north lay mighty Assyria, always ready to expand southward. To the east, the kingdom of Elam pressed against Mesopotamia's borders with its fierce warriors and different gods. To the south, the ancient city-states of Larsa and Isin commanded the wealthy temple cities of Ur, Uruk, and Nippur, the spiritual heart of Mesopotamian civilization. In the west, the kingdom of Mari controlled the vital trade routes along the Euphrates, while the mountain kingdom of Eshnunna dominated the eastern approaches to Mesopotamia. Babylon sat at the center of this dangerous web. seemingly destined to be crushed by the ambitions of its more powerful neighbors. Hammurabi understood that survival required more than military strength. It demanded strategy, patience, and the ability to turn enemies into allies when necessary. His approach to statecraft was revolutionary for its time. Rather than immediately launching wars of conquest, he spent his early years strengthening Babylon from within. His first great achievement was administrative. Hammurabi created what may have been history's first truly professional bureaucracy, a system of governors, tax collectors, judges, and scribes who could efficiently manage a large territory. He established standardized weights and measures, created a postal system for royal communications, and developed a network of royal roads that connected all parts of his growing kingdom. But Hammurabi's greatest insight was understanding the power of law itself. In 1762 BCE, after consolidating his control over central Mesopotamia, he issued what would become known as the Code of Hammurabi, one of history's first comprehensive legal systems. This wasn't simply a list of punishments for crimes, but a complete framework for organizing society. The code addressed everything from property rights and commercial transactions to family law and the treatment of slaves. It established different penalties based on social class, codified the rights of women, and created legal protections for the weak against the powerful. Most famously, it enshrined the principle of proportional justice, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, ensuring that punishments matched the severity of crimes. Picture the scene when the code was first proclaimed. Throughout Babylon and its subject cities, royal messengers read aloud the king's words. When the god Marduk commanded me to provide just ways for the people of the land and to let them have good governance, I established justice and right in the language of the land and thereby promoted the welfare of the people. This was more than law, it was a revolution in human thinking. For the first time in history, a ruler claimed that his authority came not just from divine favor or military might, but from his ability to provide justice for all his subjects. The code was carved on massive stone pillars and placed in temples throughout the empire, ensuring that everyone could know their rights and obligations under the law. But Hammurabi was also a master of realpolitik. His military campaigns were models of strategic thinking. Rather than attempting to conquer all his enemies at once, he methodically eliminated them one by one, often using alliances to prevent his targets from finding support. His first major conquest came in 1762 BCE when he turned on Esagila, the kingdom that controlled the wealthy trade routes through the Zagros Mountains. Using a combination of military force and diplomatic pressure, Hammurabi absorbed Esagila's territory and, more importantly, its established trade networks. This victory brought tremendous wealth flowing into Babylon's treasury. Next, he turned his attention to the north, gradually absorbing Assyrian territory and securing Babylon's northern borders. But his greatest prize lay to the south, where the ancient city of Larsa, under King Rim-Sinai, controlled the spiritual heartland of Mesopotamian civilization. The war against Larsa was the defining campaign of Hammurabi's reign. Rim-Sin was a formidable opponent who had ruled for over 60 years and commanded the loyalty of some of the world's oldest and most prestigious cities. The campaign required all of Hammurabi's skills as both general and diplomat. He spent years building alliances, isolating Larsa from potential allies, and gradually tightening his grip around the southern kingdom. When the final assault came in 1761 BCE, it was less a conquest than a culmination. Larsa's resistance collapsed as city after city opened their gates to the Babylonian army. With Larsa's defeat, Hammurabi controlled the cities of Nippur, Uruk, and Isin names that resonated with 3,000 years of history. He now ruled virtually all of southern Mesopotamia, an empire that encompassed the lands once controlled by the Sumerians and Akkadians. But Hammurabi understood that conquest was only the beginning. His true genius lay in his ability to transform a collection of conquered territories into a unified empire. He accomplished this through a combination of respect for local traditions and insistence on central authority. Local gods were honored and their temples maintained, but Marduk of Babylon was elevated to the head of the pantheon. Local legal traditions were preserved, but the Code of Hammurabi provided the overarching framework. Local languages and customs continued, but Akkadian became the language of administration and higher learning. Hammurabi also invested heavily in infrastructure. He built and maintained an extensive network of canals that brought water to previously arid lands, increasing agricultural productivity throughout his empire. These irrigation projects not only fed his people, but also demonstrated the power of centralized government to improve daily life. The king personally oversaw many aspects of administration, and hundreds of his letters have survived, showing a ruler deeply engaged with the details of governance. He mediated disputes between cities, supervised major construction projects, and personally reviewed legal cases. His correspondence reveals a man who saw himself not just as a conqueror, but as a father figure responsible for the welfare of all his subjects. Under Hammurabi, Babylon experienced its first golden age. The city's population swelled as people from throughout the empire came seeking opportunities in the imperial capital. Magnificent temples rose to honor the gods, while royal palaces displayed the wealth and power of the empire. The famous ziggurat of Marduk, later known as the Tower of Babel, may have been begun during this period. Scholars and scribes flocked to Babylon, making it the intellectual center of the known world. They copied and preserved the literary works of earlier civilizations while creating new works that celebrated Babylonian achievements. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature all flourished under royal patronage. But perhaps Hammurabi's greatest achievement was creating a sense of Babylonian identity that transcended ethnic and regional boundaries. People throughout the empire began to think of themselves not just as inhabitants of particular cities, but as subjects of the great king of Babylon. This identity would prove remarkably durable, surviving conquests and political upheavals for centuries to come. When Hammurabi died in 1750 BCE, he left behind more than an empire. He had created a new model of civilization. His combination of effective administration, comprehensive law, and respect for diversity would influence political thinking for millennia. The Roman Empire, medieval European kingdoms, and even modern democratic states would draw inspiration from the precedents he established. Yet even at the height of his power, Hammurabi understood the fragility of human achievement. His empire was vast but surrounded by enemies. His laws were comprehensive but required constant enforcement. His successors would inherit tremendous power, but also tremendous challenges. The golden age of the First Babylonian Empire had begun, but history would soon test whether Hammurabi's achievements could survive without the genius of their creator. Chapter 3. The Golden Age, following Hammurabi's death in 1750 BCE. The Babylonian Empire stood at the pinnacle of ancient world power. The great king's son, Samsu-iluna, inherited an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Anatolia, a realm more vast and prosperous than any the world had ever seen. Yet within this moment of triumph lay the seeds of inevitable decline. You can imagine the young Samsu-iluna walking through the halls of his father's palace, surrounded by the treasures of a dozen conquered kingdoms. Golden statues lined the corridors, tribute from subject cities filled the royal storehouses, and scribes worked day and night copying the literary treasures of the ancient world. Babylon had become the wonder of the world, a city so magnificent that future generations would struggle to believe the accounts of its splendor. But empires built by extraordinary individuals face a fundamental challenge. Can institutional strength replace personal genius? Samsu-iluna was a capable ruler, but he was not Hammurabi. He lacked his father's strategic vision, his diplomatic skills, and perhaps most importantly, his ability to inspire loyalty among diverse peoples. The first cracks in the empire appeared almost immediately. In the south, the ancient city of Larsa rose in rebellion, seeking to restore its independence under a king who claimed descent from the old royal line. This was more than mere political uprising. It was a reassertion of regional identity against Babylonian hegemony. Samsu-iluna's response revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of his position. He possessed the military resources to crush the rebellion, but doing so required brutal tactics that alienated many of his subjects. The siege of Larsa lasted for months, and when the city finally fell, Samsu-iluna ordered its destruction as an example to other potential rebels. This decision would haunt the empire for generations. Larsa had been one of Mesopotamia's oldest and most revered cities, home to temples that had stood for over 1,000 years. Its destruction was seen not just as a political act, but as an attack on the region's religious traditions. Many priests and intellectuals who had previously supported Babylonian rule began to question whether these foreign kings truly understood or respected Mesopotamian civilization. Meanwhile, new threats emerged on the empire's borders. In the south, Sealand, a mysterious kingdom in the marshes near the Persian Gulf, began raiding Babylonian territory. These weren't conventional armies, but mobile forces that could appear suddenly, strike hard, and disappear into the wetlands where Babylonian troops couldn't follow. More ominously, pressure was building in the north and west. The Hittites, a people from Anatolia who had mastered ironworking and horse-drawn warfare, were expanding eastward. Their military technology was superior to anything the Babylonians possessed, and their political organization was more flexible and adaptive. Samsu-iluna's 38-year reign became a constant struggle to maintain his father's conquests. He won many battles and successfully defended the empire's core territories, but each victory came at increasing cost. The constant warfare drained the royal treasury, disrupted trade networks, and forced the government to impose ever heavier taxes on its subjects. The cultural flowering that had characterized Hammurabi's reign continued, but with a different character. Literature became more nostalgic, looking back to a golden age that seemed to be slipping away. Religious texts emphasized the fragility of human achievement and the need for divine protection. Scholarly works focused on preserving ancient knowledge rather than creating new understanding. During this period, Babylonian scribes created some of their most important works. They compiled comprehensive dictionaries of Sumerian and Akkadian, ensuring that the literature of earlier civilizations would not be lost. They developed sophisticated mathematical techniques for calculating astronomical phenomena. They created detailed maps of the known world and comprehensive chronicles of historical events. Yet these intellectual achievements couldn't mask the empire's underlying problems. Samsu-iluna's successors, Abi-eshu, Ammi-ditana, Ammi-seduqa, and finally Samsu-ditana, each faced the same fundamental challenge: how to maintain unity in an empire that was becoming increasingly difficult to govern effectively. The later kings of the First Babylonian dynasty were not incompetent, but they ruled in impossible circumstances. The empire was simply too large to be governed effectively with ancient technology and administrative systems. Communication between the capital and distant provinces took weeks or months. Local governors had to make crucial decisions without consulting the king, and some began acting more like independent rulers than royal officials. Economic problems compounded political ones. The constant warfare had disrupted the trade networks that brought wealth to Babylon. Many of the empire's most productive regions had been devastated by fighting or rebellion. The sophisticated irrigation systems that Hammurabi had built required constant maintenance, but resources were increasingly diverted to military needs. Religious tensions also played a role in the empire's decline. Hammurabi's elevation of Marduk had never been fully accepted by traditional priesthoods throughout Mesopotamia. Many continued to regard the gods of their ancient cities as supreme, and they interpreted Babylon's troubles as divine punishment for religious presumption. During the reign of Samsudatana, the last king of Hammurabi's dynasty, these accumulated problems reached a crisis point. Rebellions erupted throughout the empire as local leaders sensed weakness at the center. The Sealand kingdom expanded its territory, taking control of several important southern cities. Assyrian forces began raiding northern Babylonian territories. Most ominously, Hittite armies under King Marduk the first were advancing through Syria, systematically conquering cities that had been Babylonian allies or tributaries. These weren't mere raids, but carefully planned campaigns aimed at destroying Babylonian power permanently. The end came with shocking suddenness. In 1595 BCE, Marduk I launched a lightning campaign down the Euphrates Valley. Rather than becoming bogged down in siege warfare, he bypassed fortified cities and struck directly at Babylon itself. The speed of his advance caught the Babylonians completely off guard. Picture the scene as Hittite chariots thundered through the gates of the world's greatest city. Babylon, which had stood unconquered for 3 centuries, fell in a matter of days. Samsudatana was killed defending his capital, and with him died the dynasty that Hammurabi had founded. The Hittites didn't stay to govern their conquest. They loaded their wagons with Babylon's treasures and withdrew to Anatolia, leaving behind a power vacuum that would reshape the entire region. The great empire that had once ruled from the mountains to the sea was no more. Yet even in destruction, Babylonian civilization proved its resilience. The city's libraries survived largely intact, preserving the literary and scientific achievements of the classical period. Many nobles and priests fled to allied cities, taking with them the knowledge and traditions that would eventually allow Babylonian culture to rise again. The fall of the First Babylonian Empire marked the end of an era, but not the end of Babylon itself. The city would rise again multiple times, each resurrection drawing strength from the memory of Hammurabi's golden age. The Code of Hammurabi would survive to influence legal thinking for thousands of years. The literary works created during this period would inspire future generations of writers and scholars. Most importantly, the idea of Babylon as a place where diverse peoples could unite under just laws, where learning was valued above warfare, where human achievement could reach its highest expression, would prove more durable than any empire. This idea would survive conquests, cultural changes, and the rise and fall of dozens of kingdoms. The First Babylonian Empire was dead, but the legend of Babylon was just beginning. Chapter 4. The Dark Age. The year is 1594 BCE, and Babylon lies in ruins. Smoke still rises from the shattered remains of Hammurabi's great palaces, while the famous walls that once protected the world's mightiest city stand broken and blackened. The Hittite army of Marduk has withdrawn to the north, their wagons heavy with the accumulated treasures of 3 centuries, leaving behind a devastated landscape and a traumatized population. You can imagine the shock and confusion that gripped the survivors. For over 200 years, Babylon had been the center of the civilized world. Its laws had governed the lives of millions, its armies had been invincible, and its wealth had seemed inexhaustible. Now, in the span of a few terrible days, all of that was gone. But nature abhors a vacuum, and the power vacuum left by Babylon's fall would soon be filled by a people who would rule Mesopotamia for the next 4 centuries, the Kassites. These were a mountain people from the Zagros ranges to the east, speaking a language unrelated to any other known tongue, and bringing with them customs and traditions that seemed alien to the sophisticated urbanites of the Mesopotamian plains. The Kassite takeover of Babylon wasn't a dramatic conquest like the Hittite raid, but rather a gradual infiltration that took place over several decades. As Babylonian authority collapsed, Kassite warbands moved down from the mountains, initially as raiders and mercenaries, but eventually as settlers and rulers. The early Kassite period represents one of the most mysterious eras in Mesopotamian history. These new rulers left relatively few records, and much of what we know about them comes from sources written centuries later. What emerges is a picture of a people caught between two worlds, trying to maintain their own cultural identity while governing a population that possessed one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations. The first Kassite kings, with names like Agum-Kakrime and Bernabariash, faced an almost impossible task. They had conquered territories where they were vastly outnumbered by their subjects, where the local population possessed administrative and technical skills they lacked, and where religious traditions stretched back thousands of years. Their solution was both pragmatic and ingenious. Rather than attempting to impose their own culture, the Kassite rulers became enthusiastic adopters and preservers of Babylonian traditions. They learned to read and write cuneiform, adopted Babylonian gods while maintaining their own, and preserved the legal and administrative systems they had inherited. This cultural accommodation created one of history's most successful examples of foreign rule. The Kassites didn't try to replace Babylonian civilization. They tried to become its legitimate heirs. They patronized temples, supported scribal schools, and commissioned the copying and preservation of ancient texts. In some ways, they became more Babylonian than the Babylonians themselves. The early Kassite period saw the gradual rebuilding of Babylon and the restoration of central authority throughout southern Mesopotamia. The new rulers proved to be capable administrators who understood the importance of the irrigation systems that sustained agricultural life in the region. They invested heavily in maintaining and expanding the canal networks, ensuring that the productivity that had made the region wealthy could be restored. During this time, Babylon was renamed Karandanish, reflecting its new Kassite identity while maintaining its position as the region's primary city. The famous ziggurat of Marduk was rebuilt, though not yet to the massive scale it would later achieve. New palaces rose on the foundations of the old, incorporating both traditional Mesopotamian architectural styles and distinctive Kassite elements. The Kassite period also saw important developments in international relations. Unlike their predecessors, who had focused primarily on regional dominance, the Kassite kings established diplomatic relationships with distant powers. Letters found at Amarna in Egypt reveal extensive correspondence between Kassite rulers and Egyptian pharaohs, treating each other as equals in what amounted to the world's first international diplomatic system. These diplomatic relationships brought new ideas and technologies to Babylon. Egyptian gold flowed into Kassite treasuries in exchange for lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and precious woods from the Iranian mountains. The famous Babylonian chronicles detailed historical records that would become models for later historiography may have been inspired by Egyptian royal annals. But the Kassites' greatest achievement was cultural. During their rule, Mesopotamian literature experienced a remarkable renaissance. The Epic of Gilgamesh was compiled into its standard form, drawing together ancient Sumerian tales into a unified narrative that explored themes of mortality, friendship, and the search for meaning that would resonate across cultures and centuries. This period also saw the creation of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that placed Marduk at the center of the cosmic order. This wasn't merely a religious text but a political statement, asserting Babylon's spiritual primacy over all other cities. The epic's sophisticated theology and complex literary structure demonstrated that Babylonian civilization was not only surviving under foreign rule, but actually flourishing. Scientific and mathematical knowledge advanced significantly during the Kassite period. Babylonian astronomers developed increasingly sophisticated methods for predicting celestial events, creating mathematical models that would influence Greek and Islamic astronomy centuries later. Mathematical texts from this period show the development of algebraic thinking and the systematic use of place value notation. However, The Kassite period was not without its challenges. The kingdom faced constant pressure from neighbors who viewed the foreign rulers as illegitimate usurpers. To the north, the Assyrians were gradually building the military machine that would eventually dominate the entire region. To the east, Elam remained a persistent threat, launching periodic invasions that kept the Kassites constantly on the defensive. The relationship between the Kassites and Assyria was particularly complex. Both kingdoms claimed to be the legitimate heirs of ancient Mesopotamian civilization, and both sought to control the valuable trade routes that connected the Iranian plateau with the Mediterranean coast. This rivalry would define regional politics for centuries. During the later Kassite period, rulers like Kuragazu-I and Nebuchadnezzar I, not to be confused with the more famous later king of the same name, attempted to restore Babylonian military power and territorial control. They achieved some notable successes, including campaigns that temporarily brought parts of Syria and Palestine under Babylonian influence. But these military adventures came at great cost. The constant warfare drained the royal treasury and disrupted the agricultural and commercial activities that sustained the kingdom's prosperity. Moreover, the Kassites' military technology was becoming increasingly obsolete compared to their neighbors, particularly the Assyrians, who had mastered ironworking and more advanced siege techniques. The Kassite period also witnessed significant social and religious changes. The long period of foreign rule had created a more cosmopolitan society, where different ethnic groups and cultural traditions coexisted more peacefully than in earlier periods. This cultural mixing produced new art forms, architectural styles, and literary genres that would influence Mesopotamian civilization for centuries. Religious practice during this period became more personal and less focused on royal patronage. Private individuals increasingly commissioned their own religious texts and artifacts, creating a more diverse and decentralized religious landscape. This democratization of religious life would have profound implications for later Babylonian and Jewish religious development. The end of Kassite rule came not through internal collapse, but through external conquest. In 1157 BCE, the Elamite king Shutrak-Nahantel launched a devastating invasion that captured Babylon and carried off thousands of inhabitants, including the royal family, into captivity. The famous stele containing Hammurabi's code was among the treasures carried off to Susa, where it would remain until modern archaeologists rediscovered it. The Elamite conquest marked the end of Kassite rule, but their legacy was profound. They had preserved Babylonian civilization during a crucial transitional period, ensuring that the cultural achievements of Hammurabi's era would survive to inspire future generations. They had created new forms of international diplomacy and cultural exchange that would influence political development throughout the ancient world. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that successful rule in Mesopotamia required not just military strength, but cultural legitimacy, the ability to position oneself as the rightful heir to the region's ancient traditions while adapting to changing circumstances. The Dark Age was ending, but new challenges lay ahead as Babylon prepared to enter another period of independence and greatness. Chapter 5. The Assyrian Shadow in the Aftermath of the Elamite Conquest of 1157 BCE. Babylon lay prostrate once again, its treasures scattered, its people enslaved or exiled, and its proud traditions seemingly broken forever. Yet from this nadir of despair would emerge one of ancient history's most remarkable stories of resilience and eventual triumph, the gradual resurrection of Babylonian power under the second dynasty of Asin. Picture the devastated landscape that greeted the survivors of Elamite destruction. The great palaces lay in ruins, their cedar beams burned and their treasuries emptied. The ziggurat of Marduk stood damaged and neglected, its regular sacrifices interrupted for the first time in centuries. Many of the city's most skilled craftsmen, scholars, and administrators had been marched away to Susa in chains, taking with them irreplaceable knowledge and expertise. But Mesopotamian civilization had faced catastrophe before and survived. In the southern cities of Izin, Larsa, and Ur, local leaders began organizing resistance against the Elamite occupiers. These weren't grand military campaigns, but patient efforts to preserve what remained of Babylonian culture, while slowly building strength for an eventual reconquest. The hero of this dark period was a king named Nebuchadnezzar, not the famous builder of the Hanging Gardens, but an earlier ruler whose courage and determination earned him a place among Babylon's greatest monarchs. Rising from the ancient city of Asun around 1125 BCE, he would spend his entire reign fighting to restore Babylonian independence and dignity. Nebuchadnezzar understood that military victory alone would not be enough to restore Babylon's greatness. The kingdom needed to rebuild its economic base, restore its religious legitimacy, and most importantly, develop the military capabilities necessary to compete with its increasingly powerful neighbors, particularly the Assyrians, who were emerging as the region's dominant force. His first great achievement was the liberation of Babylon itself. In a series of carefully planned campaigns, Nebuchadnezzar's forces gradually pushed the Elamites back across the Zagros Mountains. The climactic moment came when Babylonian troops stormed the enemy capital of Susa and recovered the stolen statue of Marduk, along with thousands of other sacred objects that the Elamites had carried away. You can imagine the celebrations that erupted throughout Mesopotamia when news arrived that Marduk had returned home. Processions filled the streets of every Babylonian city as priests and people welcomed back their patron deity. This wasn't merely a military victory, but a spiritual restoration that demonstrated to everyone that the gods still favor Babylon despite its recent sufferings. But Nebuchadnezzar's greatest challenge wasn't Elam, it was the growing power of Assyria. Under a series of brilliant warrior kings, the northern kingdom had been steadily expanding its territory and military capabilities. Assyrian forces had mastered iron weapons, developed sophisticated siege techniques, and created the ancient world's most professional army. The struggle between Babylon and Assyria that began during this period would define Mesopotamian politics for the next 5 centuries. It was more than a simple territorial dispute. It was a clash between two different visions of civilization. Assyria represented military efficiency, imperial expansion, and centralized control. Babylon embodied cultural sophistication, religious authority, and commercial prosperity. Initially, Nebuchadnezzar I achieved remarkable success against the Assyrians, winning several major battles and temporarily halting their southward expansion. His victories inspired a resurgence of Babylonian confidence and attracted support from cities throughout southern Mesopotamia that preferred Babylonian rule to Assyrian domination. However, these successes proved temporary. The fundamental military and technological advantages that the Assyrians possessed became more apparent over time. Their iron weapons were superior to Babylonian bronze. Their cavalry and chariot forces were more mobile and better trained, and their siege equipment could breach fortifications that had protected Mesopotamian cities for centuries. More importantly, the Assyrians had developed a systematic approach to imperial administration that allowed them to control vast territories more effectively than any previous power. They established permanent garrisons in conquered territories, deported rebellious populations to prevent organized resistance, and created professional bureaucracies that could govern diverse populations efficiently. Following Nebuchadnezzar's death around 1103 BCE, Babylon entered a prolonged period of decline and intermittent Assyrian domination. Some Babylonian kings ruled as vassals of Assyrian monarchs, while others achieved temporary independence only to lose it again when Assyrian armies returned. This period saw the emergence of new ethnic groups that would play crucial roles in later Mesopotamian history. Iranian tribes migrated from the Syrian desert into the fertile valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, bringing with them their own languages, customs, and political traditions. Initially viewed as barbarian invaders, these Arameans gradually integrated into Mesopotamian society while maintaining their distinct identity. Even more significant was the arrival of the Chaldeans, a Semitic people who settled in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia. Unlike the Arameans, who remained primarily nomadic, the Chaldeans quickly adapted to urban life and began competing for political control with established Babylonian families. The relationship between these newcomers and the traditional Babylonian elite was complex and often tense. The established priesthoods and noble families resented the political ambitions of these outsiders, while the Arameans and Chaldeans viewed the old elite as corrupt and ineffective. Yet over time, intermarriage and cultural exchange created a more diverse but also more dynamic society. During this period of foreign domination and internal division, Babylonian culture faced its greatest test. Would the sophisticated intellectual traditions that had flourished under Hammurabi and the Kassites survive conquest and occupation? Would the religious practices that connected Babylon to its ancient past continue to provide meaning and identity to a defeated people? The answer proved to be a resounding yes. In fact, adversity seemed to inspire rather than suppress Babylonian creativity. Scribal schools continued to copy and preserve ancient texts while creating new works that addressed contemporary concerns. Priests developed increasingly sophisticated theological systems that explained current suffering while maintaining hope for future restoration. This period saw the creation of some of Mesopotamian literature's most profound works. The Babylonian Theodicy grappled with questions of divine justice and human suffering that would later influence Jewish and Christian theology. New versions of ancient myths incorporated themes of exile and return that resonated with contemporary experience. Scientific and mathematical knowledge also continued to advance. Babylonian astronomers during this period developed mathematical techniques for predicting celestial phenomena with unprecedented accuracy. Their observations and calculations would eventually influence Greek astronomy and, through Greek sources, Islamic and medieval European science. The most powerful Assyrian rulers, particularly Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and Sennacherib, attempted to solve the Babylonian problem through various approaches. Some tried to rule Babylon directly as a conquered province. Others attempted to co-opt Babylonian elites by offering them positions in the imperial administration. Still others pursued policies of cultural suppression designed to eliminate Babylonian identity entirely. None of these approaches proved successful in the long term. Babylonian society possessed a resilience that frustrated every attempt at permanent subjugation. Each generation produced new leaders who drew inspiration from the memory of past greatness while adapting to contemporary realities. The nadir of this long struggle came during the reign of the Assyrian king Sennacherib, who in 689 BCE ordered the complete destruction of Babylon. His forces demolished the city's walls, burned its temples, and attempted to obliterate every trace of its existence. Yet, even this ultimate act of vengeance failed to destroy the idea of Babylon. Sennacherib's son and successor, Esarhaddon, understood that destroying Babylon had been a mistake. He ordered the city's rebuilding and attempted to reconcile Assyrian power with Babylonian traditions. This policy of accommodation worked better than previous approaches, but it created new problems within the Assyrian ruling class. The final act of this long drama began during the reign of Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king. Despite his efforts to maintain unity, civil war erupted between Ashurbanipal and his brother Shamash-shum-ukin, who ruled Babylon as Assyrian viceroy but increasingly acted as an independent king. The war devastated both kingdoms and weakened Assyrian power throughout the empire. When it ended with Shamash-shum-ukin's defeat and death in 648 BCE, Assyria had won a Pyrrhic victory that left it vulnerable to new challengers. The stage was now set for Babylon's final and greatest resurrection under the Chaldean dynasty, a restoration that would make the city more magnificent than ever before, while simultaneously ensuring its place in the religious imagination of humanity. Chapter 6. The Chaldean Revolution. The year is 627 BCE, and across the vast Assyrian Empire, the foundations of power are beginning to crumble. Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, has just died, leaving behind an empire stretched to its breaking point by centuries of constant warfare and internal strife. In the southern marshlands of Mesopotamia, a Chaldean chieftain named Nabopolassar is about to launch a revolution that will reshape the ancient world and restore Babylon to heights of power and glory it had never before achieved. You can imagine Nabopolassar in his stronghold among the reeds and waterways of the southern marshes, watching as reports arrive of chaos in the Assyrian heartland. Provincial governors were declaring independence, subject peoples were rising in revolt, and the mighty army that had terrorized the known world for centuries was fragmenting into competing factions. For a man who had spent his life fighting Assyrian domination, this moment represented the opportunity of a lifetime. But Nabopolassar was no mere opportunist. The Chaldeans were a Semitic people who had migrated into southern Mesopotamia during the previous centuries, bringing with them a warrior culture and political traditions that differed significantly from both the established Babylonian elite and their Assyrian overlords. They had maintained their tribal organization while adapting to urban life, creating a unique synthesis of nomadic military effectiveness and settled administrative capability. The Chaldeans also possessed something that previous challengers to Assyrian rule had lacked: a clear vision of what should replace the empire they sought to destroy. Unlike the Aramean tribes who had contented themselves with raiding and pillaging, the Chaldeans intended to create a new imperial order centered on Babylon and drawing upon the accumulated cultural wealth of Mesopotamian civilization. Nabopolassar's rise to power began in 626 BCE with a carefully planned revolt against Assyrian authority in Babylon. Rather than launching a direct assault on the heavily fortified city, he used his knowledge of local conditions to cut off its supply lines and gradually tighten his grip around the Assyrian garrison. When the city finally fell, it was through a combination of military pressure and popular uprising rather than siege warfare. The liberation of Babylon sent shockwaves throughout the empire. For over a century, Assyrian propaganda had proclaimed that the great city was finally pacified and that Babylonian independence was impossible. Now, suddenly, the ancient capital of southern Mesopotamia was free again, and its liberator was actively encouraging similar revolts throughout the region. But Nabopolassar understood that holding Babylon would be far more difficult than taking it. The Assyrians still possessed the most powerful military machine in the known world, and they would inevitably attempt to retake their most important possession. To succeed, the Chaldean king needed allies, and he found them in the most unlikely places. The most important of these alliances was with the Medes, an Iranian people who controlled much of the territory east of Mesopotamia. Under their king Siatzers, the Medes had been building their own empire and had their own reasons for wanting to see Assyrian power broken forever. The alliance between Nabopolassar and Saxers represented one of history's first great examples of international cooperation for mutual strategic benefit. The Medo-Babylonian alliance fundamentally changed the balance of power in the ancient Near East. Previously, rebellions against Assyrian rule had been isolated affairs that could be suppressed one at a time. Now the empire faced coordinated attacks on multiple fronts from enemies who possessed sufficient military resources to challenge Assyrian supremacy directly. The war that followed was brutal and decisive. Assyrian forces found themselves fighting on two fronts while also dealing with internal rebellions and economic collapse. The famous Assyrian war machine, which had seemed invincible for so long, began to disintegrate under the pressure of simultaneous challenges it couldn't effectively address. The climax came in 612 BCE with the fall of Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. Picture the scene as Babylonian and Median forces stormed through the city that had been the seat of imperial power for over 2 centuries. The great palaces that had housed the treasures of the known world were put to the torch. The royal libraries that contained the accumulated wisdom of Mesopotamian civilization were scattered to the winds. The city that had been the terror of nations was reduced to rubble in a matter of days. The destruction of Nineveh marked more than the end of a dynasty. It represented the collapse of an entire world order. The Assyrian Empire, which had seemed as permanent as the mountains, simply ceased to exist. Its territories were divided between the victorious allies, with Babylon claiming dominance over most of Mesopotamia and much of the eastern Mediterranean coast. But Nabopolassar's greatest achievement wasn't military. It was his success in creating a new vision of Babylonian identity that could unite the diverse peoples of his empire. Unlike the Assyrians, who had ruled through fear and forced deportation, the Chaldean kings portrayed themselves as liberators who had restored the natural order by placing Babylon at the center of the civilized world. This ideological transformation drew heavily upon Mesopotamian religious traditions while adapting them to contemporary political realities. Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, was portrayed not just as the supreme deity, but as the cosmic force that had guided the destruction of the impious Assyrians and the restoration of righteous rule. The annual New Year festival, which celebrated Marduk's victory over the forces of chaos, became a powerful symbol of Babylonian renewal and imperial legitimacy. Nabopolassar also initiated ambitious building projects designed to demonstrate the restored power and prosperity of his kingdom. The famous walls of Babylon, which would later inspire wonder throughout the ancient world, were begun during his reign. New temples rose throughout the kingdom, staffed by priests who proclaimed the righteousness of Chaldean rule while preserving the ancient traditions that connected Babylon to its glorious past. The economic foundation of the new empire was equally impressive. Control over Mesopotamia's irrigation systems provided agricultural wealth, while domination of trade routes between Asia and the Mediterranean brought commercial prosperity. Tribute flowed into Babylon from subject territories, while voluntary trade relationships developed with distant kingdoms that preferred Babylonian goods and services to Assyrian intimidation. Perhaps most importantly, Nabopolassar established the principle that would guide his dynasty. The idea that Babylon's greatness should be expressed not through military conquest alone, but through cultural achievement and architectural magnificence. This vision would reach its full expression under his son and successor, but its foundations were laid during these crucial early years. The international situation following Assyria's fall was complex and dangerous. Egypt, which had been Assyria's ally during the final years, remained hostile to the new Babylonian Empire. Various smaller kingdoms in Syria and Palestine were uncertain about their future allegiances. Most ominously, the growing power of the Median Empire suggested that yesterday's ally might become tomorrow's rival. Nabopolassar handled these challenges with the same combination of military effectiveness and diplomatic skill that had brought him to power. He maintained the alliance with the Medes while carefully avoiding provocations that might destabilize it. He pursued a policy of measured expansion that secured vital territories without overextending his forces. Most importantly, he began preparing for the greatest transfer of power in his dynasty's history, the succession of his son Nebuchadnezzar. The relationship between Nabopolassar and his heir was one of history's most successful examples of dynastic cooperation. Rather than waiting to inherit power, the young Nebuchadnezzar served as his father's chief general and co-ruler, gaining practical experience in military command and imperial administration, while the old king remained available for guidance and support. When Nabopolassar died in 605 BCE, the succession proceeded smoothly because the groundwork had been carefully prepared. The empire he left to his son was prosperous, unified, and confident in its future. The stage was set for the greatest period in Babylonian history, an era when the city would become so magnificent that its memory would outlast the empire itself. The Chaldean Revolution had succeeded beyond its founders' wildest dreams. What began as a tribal rebellion against foreign oppression had become the foundation for a new golden age that would make ancient Babylon synonymous with power, wisdom, and architectural wonder. The greatest king in Babylonian history was about to take the throne. Chapter 7. Nebuchadnezzar the Great. In 605 BCE, as the ancient world still reeled from the sudden collapse of the mighty Assyrian Empire, a young prince named Nebuchadnezzar ascended to the throne of Babylon. At just 25 years old, he inherited an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Anatolia, but inheritance was only the beginning of his story. Over the next 43 years, this remarkable ruler would transform Babylon into the most magnificent city the world had ever seen, while establishing an empire that dominated the ancient Near East like no power before or since. Picture the young king as he stood before the great throne of his father, surrounded by the treasures of a dozen conquered kingdoms and the representatives of nations that now paid homage to Babylon. Behind him rose the ancient ziggurat of Marduk, already impressive but destined to grow even grander under his rule. Before him lay challenges that would have daunted even the most experienced ruler: restive subjects, ambitious neighbors, and the enormous task of consolidating the gains his father had won through warfare and diplomacy. But Nebuchadnezzar too, for this was his full royal name, possessed qualities that set him apart from every other ruler of his era. He combined the military genius of the greatest conquerors with the administrative skills of the most effective peacetime rulers. He understood both the brutal realities of ancient warfare and the subtle requirements of cultural leadership. Most importantly, he possessed a vision of what Babylon could become that went far beyond mere territorial expansion. His first great challenge came almost immediately. Egypt, under Pharaoh Necho II, had never accepted the new balance of power that emerged from Assyria's fall. Egyptian forces were advancing through Palestine and Syria, seeking to establish a sphere of influence that would bring them into direct conflict with Babylonian interests. The young king understood that his response to this challenge would define his entire reign. The confrontation came at Carchemish in 605 BCE, where Egyptian and Babylonian armies met in one of the ancient world's most decisive battles. Nebuchadnezzar, commanding the Babylonian forces personally, achieved a victory so complete that Egyptian power in the region was broken for a generation. More importantly, his conduct during the campaign demonstrated to his subjects and enemies alike that the new king possessed both the strategic vision and personal courage necessary for greatness. Following his victory at Carchemish, Nebuchadnezzar launched a series of campaigns that extended Babylonian control throughout the Levant. City after city submitted to his authority, either through negotiated surrender or military conquest. Jerusalem, Tyre, Damascus, the great centers of wealth and power in the eastern Mediterranean, all acknowledged Babylonian supremacy. But Nebuchadnezzar's approach to conquest was fundamentally different from that of his Assyrian predecessors. Rather than ruling through terror and mass deportation, he preferred to co-opt local elites and preserve existing social structures while ensuring ultimate loyalty to Babylon. This policy proved more effective in the long term, creating a more stable and prosperous empire than the Assyrians had ever achieved. The conquest of Jerusalem in 597 BCE exemplified this approach. When the young king Jehoiachin refused to pay tribute, Nebuchadnezzar besieged the city until it surrendered. However, rather than destroying Jerusalem entirely, he deported only the royal family and skilled craftsmen to Babylon, leaving the general population in place under a new, more compliant ruler. This selective deportation policy served multiple purposes. It removed potential leaders of future rebellions while bringing talented individuals to Babylon where their skills could benefit the empire. Many of these deportees, including the prophet Ezekiel and the future prophet Daniel, would go on to play important roles in Babylonian society while maintaining their distinct cultural identities. The most famous of these deportations occurred in 586 BCE, when Jerusalem rebelled again under King Zedekiah. This time, Nebuchadnezzar's response was decisive and final. The city was besieged for over 2 years before falling, and the great Temple of Solomon was destroyed. Thousands of inhabitants were marched to Babylon in what became known as the Babylonian captivity, an event that would profoundly influence Jewish theology and, through Jewish sources, the entire Western religious tradition. But Nebuchadnezzar's greatest achievements weren't military. They were architectural and cultural. Determined to make Babylon worthy of its imperial status, he launched the most ambitious building program in ancient history. The results would earn Babylon fame that outlasted the empire itself, creating structures so magnificent that later generations would struggle to believe they had ever existed. The centerpiece of his architectural program was the reconstruction of Babylon's central ceremonial district. The famous Ishtar Gate, decorated with brilliant blue glazed bricks and golden reliefs of dragons and bulls, became the most spectacular entrance to any ancient city. The processional way that led through this gate was paved with polished stone and lined with walls decorated with artistic masterpieces that celebrated both Babylonian power and divine favor. The royal palace complex that Nebuchadnezzar created was equally impressive. Covering over 40 acres, it included multiple courtyards, throne rooms capable of holding thousands of people, and residential quarters for the royal family that surpassed the palaces of any other ruler. The throne room itself, with its walls covered in glazed bricks depicting the Tree of Life and other sacred symbols, created an atmosphere of divine majesty that reinforced the king's religious authority. Perhaps most famous of all were the legendary Hanging Gardens, which ancient writers counted among the 7 wonders of the world. According to tradition, Nebuchadnezzar created these elevated gardens to comfort his wife Amadis, a Median princess who missed the mountains and greenery of her homeland. Whether the gardens actually existed remains debated by modern scholars, but their legendary status demonstrates the impression of magnificent prosperity that Babylon created in the ancient imagination. The king's most ambitious project was the completion of the Great Ziggurat of Marduk, known to later generations as the Tower of Babel. This massive structure, rising nearly 300 feet above the city, served as both religious temple and symbol of Babylonian power. Its 7 levels, each painted a different color and accessible by a spiral ramp, created a mountain of human achievement that could be seen for miles across the Mesopotamian plain. But Nebuchadnezzar understood that lasting greatness required more than impressive architecture. He invested heavily in education and scholarship, making Babylon the intellectual center of the ancient world. Scribal schools flourished under royal patronage, preserving ancient texts while creating new works that celebrated Babylonian achievements. The royal library became a repository of human knowledge that attracted scholars from throughout the known world. Scientific research also flourished during this period. Babylonian astronomers developed mathematical techniques for predicting celestial phenomena with unprecedented accuracy. Their observations and calculations would eventually influence Greek science and, through Greek sources, Islamic and medieval European scholarship. Medical knowledge advanced significantly, with Babylonian physicians developing surgical techniques and pharmaceutical preparations that remained influential for centuries. The economic prosperity that supported these cultural achievements was equally impressive. Control over Mesopotamia's irrigation systems ensured agricultural abundance, while Babylon's position on major trade routes brought commercial wealth from across the known world. The standardized weights and measures that Nebuchadnezzar established facilitated trade throughout the empire, while his legal reforms provided the stability that commercial prosperity required. International relations during Nebuchadnezzar's reign reflected Babylon's newfound status as the world's dominant power. Diplomatic correspondence from this period shows the king treating with other rulers as equals or superiors, negotiating marriages and treaties that recognized Babylonian hegemony, while maintaining peaceful relationships with powers too distant to threaten. The empire's internal administration was equally sophisticated. Provincial governors reported directly to the king through an efficient postal system, while royal inspectors ensured that local officials remained loyal and effective. The integration of diverse ethnic groups within a unified imperial structure created a cosmopolitan society that would influence political thinking for centuries. When Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BCE, after ruling for 43 years, he left behind an empire at the height of its power and prosperity. Babylon had become synonymous with magnificence, wisdom, and imperial authority. His architectural achievements would inspire wonder for generations, while his administrative innovations would influence empire building for centuries. Yet even at this moment of triumph, the seeds of future decline were already present. The empire had grown wealthy and powerful, but it had also grown complex and difficult to govern. The very success that Nebuchadnezzar had achieved would create challenges that his successors would struggle to address. The golden age of Babylon had reached its zenith, but the story of the lost kingdom was far from over. Chapter 8. The mysterious hanging in the heart of ancient Babylon. Rising like a green mountain above the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia, stood what may have been the most extraordinary architectural achievement of the ancient world: the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon. These miraculous terraced gardens, where exotic plants cascaded from towering structures in defiance of the desert climate, captured the imagination of every ancient writer who described them, and continue to fascinate us today, nearly 500 years after their supposed destruction. You can imagine approaching these gardens on a brilliant morning in the 6th century BCE, perhaps as part of a diplomatic delegation arriving to pay homage to the great king Nebuchadnezzar II. The first thing that would strike you would be the impossibility of what you were seeing. A Todning, lush green paradise rising tier by tier above the city, with water flowing in streams and waterfalls that seemed to spring from nowhere, nourishing trees and flowers that had no business surviving in the arid heart of Mesopotamia. According to the ancient accounts that have come down to us, the gardens were an expression of royal love unprecedented in human history. Nebuchadnezzar, so the story goes, created this wonder to comfort his beloved wife Amadis, a princess from the mountainous kingdom of Media, who had grown homesick for the green hills and flowing streams of her distant homeland. In response to her melancholy, the king commanded his architects and engineers to create an artificial mountain where she could walk among familiar plants and hear the sound of running water. The Greek historian Scribal, writing in the 1st century BCE, described the gardens in detail that still takes our breath away. The garden is quadrangular in shape, and each side is 4 plethra in length. It consists of arched vaults, which are situated, one after another, on checkered, cube-like foundations. The checkered foundations, which are hollowed out, are covered so deep with earth that they admit of the largest of trees, having been constructed of baked brick and asphalt. Picture the engineering marvel that such a structure would have represented. The gardens rose in a series of terraces, each level supported by massive vaulted chambers that contained the elaborate irrigation system necessary to keep the vegetation alive. Water was lifted from the Euphrates River through a complex mechanism that may have included the world's first known chain pumps, bronze devices that could raise water hundreds of feet through a system of chains, buckets, and gears. The scale of this undertaking was staggering. Ancient sources suggest that the gardens covered an area roughly equivalent to a modern city block and rose to a height of 75 feet, the equivalent of a 7-story building constructed entirely of gardens with enough soil depth to support full-grown trees on every level. The engineering challenges of creating and maintaining such a structure would have taxed the capabilities of any civilization in the ancient world. But the Hanging Gardens were only the most famous of Babylon's architectural wonders. Under Nebuchadnezzar's direction, the entire city had been transformed into a showcase of human achievement that dazzled visitors and intimidated enemies. The famous walls of Babylon, which Herodotus claimed were so thick that two four-horse chariots could pass each other on their ramparts, enclosed an urban area roughly the size of modern Chicago. These walls weren't merely defensive structures. They were artistic statements that proclaimed Babylonian power to the world. Decorated with glazed bricks in brilliant colors, they depicted lions, dragons, and bulls that served both as religious symbols and demonstrations of the kingdom's wealth. The famous Ishtar Gate, the main entrance to the inner city, was covered with over 575 relief images of these sacred animals, each one meticulously crafted and fired in the intense blues and golds that became Babylon's signature colors. The processional way that led through the Ishtar Gate was itself a marvel of urban planning and artistic achievement. This broad avenue, paved with polished limestone and red breccia, was lined with walls decorated with over 120 relief lions, the symbol of the goddess Ishtar. During religious festivals, processions of priests, nobles, and citizens would march along this route, creating spectacles that reinforced both religious devotion and political loyalty. Rising above all these earthly magnificences was the great ziggurat of Marduk, known to later generations as the Tower of Babel. This massive structure, rebuilt and expanded under Nebuchadnezzar, represented the ultimate fusion of religious devotion and imperial ambition. Standing nearly 300 feet tall and built in 7 levels, each painted a different color, it served as both temple and symbol of Babylonian achievement. The ziggurat wasn't merely a monument, it was the spiritual and political center of the empire. At its summit stood the shrine of Marduk, where the king performed the sacred rituals that legitimized his rule and ensured divine favor for his kingdom. The annual New Year festival, when the king climbed to the ziggurat's peak to participate in the sacred marriage ceremony that renewed the cosmic order, drew pilgrims from throughout the known world. Inside the city's palaces and temples, artistic achievement reached heights that wouldn't be equaled for centuries. The throne room of Nebuchadnezzar's palace, with its walls covered in glazed bricks depicting the sacred tree of life, created an atmosphere of divine majesty that overwhelmed visitors. The careful integration of religious symbolism, artistic beauty, and political messaging in these decorations demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how architecture could serve both practical and propaganda purposes. The engineering capabilities that made these wonders possible represented the culmination of over 3,000 years of Mesopotamian technological development. Babylonian architects had mastered the use of the arch and vault, allowing them to create large interior spaces and support massive weights. Their understanding of hydraulics enabled them to move water over great distances and heights, making possible not only the Hanging Gardens, but also the complex systems of fountains and pools that cooled and beautified the royal palaces. The materials used in these constructions came from across the known world, demonstrating both Babylon's wealth and its extensive trade networks. Cedar wood came from the mountains of Lebanon, gold from Egypt and Anatolia, lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan, and precious stones from India and Iran. The city became a showcase not just of Babylonian achievement, but of the resources and craftsmanship available throughout the ancient world. Yet despite the detailed ancient descriptions and the obvious pride that Babylonians took in their architectural achievements, modern archaeology has failed to find definitive evidence for the Hanging Gardens. Excavations at the site of ancient Babylon have uncovered remains of palaces, temples, and walls, but nothing that clearly corresponds to the gardens described by ancient writers. This mystery has led some scholars to propose alternative theories. Dr. Stephanie Daly of Oxford University has suggested that the famous gardens were actually built not in Babylon, but in Nineveh, the the former Assyrian capital, by King Sennacherib decades before Nebuchadnezzar's reign. According to this theory, later Greek writers confused the two Mesopotamian capitals and attributed Assyrian achievements to the more famous Babylonian king. Other scholars argue that the gardens did exist in Babylon, but have been lost to time and the changing course of the Euphrates River. The site where they supposedly stood may now lie underwater or beneath later construction that makes archaeological investigation impossible. Alternatively, the gardens may have been built using more perishable materials than other Babylonian monuments, leaving fewer traces for modern archaeologists to discover. The debate over the garden's existence reflects a larger question about the relationship between historical fact and cultural memory. Whether or not the Hanging Gardens actually existed as described, they clearly existed in the imagination of the ancient world as symbols of human achievement and royal power. Ancient writers used them to illustrate the magnificent prosperity that Babylonian civilization had achieved under Nebuchadnezzar's rule. The gardens also represented something deeper, the human desire to transcend natural limitations through technology and determination. In an age when most people lived closely tied to the rhythms of nature, the idea of creating an artificial paradise where foreign plants could flourish in hostile climates captured imaginations in ways that purely practical achievements could not. Whether real or legendary, the Hanging Gardens became part of Babylon's mythical status in the ancient world. They represented the city's ability to achieve the impossible, to create beauty and wonder through human ingenuity and royal will. Along with the Tower of Babel, the Ishtar Gate, and the mighty walls, they established Babylon's reputation as a place where the normal rules of the world seemed suspended. This reputation would outlast the empire itself, ensuring that Babylon remained a symbol of human achievement and divine power long after its political importance had ended. Chapter 9. The Tower of Babel rising majestically above the ancient city of Babylon. Dominating the skyline like a man-made mountain painted in the colors of the rainbow, stood the great ziggurat of Etemenanke, the structure that would be remembered throughout history as the Tower of Babel. This magnificent edifice, completed during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, represented far more than architectural achievement. It embodied the intersection of human ambition and divine will, of earthly power and spiritual authority, that would capture the imagination of religious thinkers for millennia to come. Picture yourself as a traveler approaching Babylon in the 6th century BCE, perhaps part of a caravan bringing tribute from distant lands or a diplomatic mission seeking audience with the great king. Long before you could see the city's famous walls or the glittering Ishtar Gate, you would spot the tower rising from the horizon like a beacon of human achievement. Its 7 levels, each painted a different color: white, black, purple, blue, vermilion, silver, and gold at the summit, created a visual impact that announced to all the world that they were approaching the most magnificent city on earth. The Tower of Babel, as described in the Bible, represents one of humanity's most enduring stories about the relationship between divine authority and human ambition. According to the book of Genesis, the people of Babylon sought to build a tower that would reach to heaven itself, declaring, "Come, let us build ourselves a city, and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." In response to this act of presumption, God confused their languages so that they could no longer understand each other, forcing them to abandon their project and scatter across the earth. This story has resonated through thousands of years of religious teaching as a warning about the dangers of human pride and the importance of humility before divine authority. But the historical reality behind this legendary tale was far more complex and fascinating than the biblical narrative suggests. The great ziggurat that inspired the Tower of Babel story was indeed a product of extraordinary human ambition, but it was built not in defiance of the gods, but in their honor. Far from being an act of rebellion against divine authority, It represented the ultimate expression of Mesopotamian religious devotion and architectural skill. The ziggurat of Enuma, whose name means house of the foundation of heaven and earth, was the centerpiece of Babylon's religious life and the physical manifestation of the city's spiritual authority. Standing nearly 300 feet tall and covering an area roughly equivalent to 2 city blocks, it served as both temple and symbol of the cosmic order that Babylonian civilization claimed to represent. Construction of the tower spanned several reigns, but it reached its final magnificent form under Nebuchadnezzar II, who invested enormous resources in completing what he saw as his most important building project. Ancient cuneiform texts describe the king's personal involvement in the construction, recording his declaration, "I made it the wonder of the people of the world. I raised its top to the heaven, made doors for the gates, and I covered it with bitumen and bricks." The structure itself was a masterpiece of engineering and religious symbolism. Built in 7 levels that corresponded to the 7 celestial spheres recognized in Mesopotamian cosmology, each level was painted a different color that corresponded to a particular planetary deity. Visitors would ascend via a spiral ramp that wound around the exterior, making the climb to the summit both a physical journey and a spiritual pilgrimage through the layers of the cosmos. At the tower's summit stood the shrine of Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, where the most sacred rituals of the kingdom were performed. Only the king and the highest priests were permitted to enter this Holy of Holies, where they performed ceremonies that were believed to maintain the cosmic order and ensure divine favor for the empire. The annual New Year festival, which concluded with the king's ascent to the tower's peak, was the most important religious event in the Babylonian calendar. The tower also served crucial political functions that reinforced royal authority and imperial unity. Its enormous scale and magnificent decoration demonstrated Babylonian wealth and power to visitors from throughout the known world. The technical expertise required for its construction showcased the kingdom's engineering capabilities and artistic sophistication. Most importantly, the religious ceremonies performed at its summit provided divine legitimation for royal authority. Archaeological evidence has confirmed many details about the historical Tower of Babel. Excavations at Babylon have uncovered the massive foundation platform on which the ziggurat stood, along with numerous cuneiform tablets that describe its construction and ritual use. A remarkable stone stele, discovered in private collections and dating to Nebuchadnezzar's reign, actually shows the tower from the front, clearly depicting its 7 levels and providing a ground plan of the temple at its summit. This archaeological evidence helps us understand how the biblical story of the Tower of Babel developed. Jewish exiles living in Babylon during the period of the Babylonian captivity would have seen the great ziggurat daily, observing the religious ceremonies performed at its summit and hearing the Babylonian claims about its cosmic significance. For monotheistic Jews who believed in one universal God, the tower's role in polytheistic worship would have seemed deeply problematic. The biblical account transforms this impressive religious monument into a cautionary tale about the dangers of human pride and the importance of divine authority. The story reflects Jewish theological concerns about idolatry and the proper relationship between humanity and God, using the most impressive structure in their contemporary world as a symbol of misguided human ambition. The confusion of languages described in the biblical account may reflect the real linguistic diversity that Jewish exiles encountered in cosmopolitan Babylon. The Neo-Babylonian Empire included people speaking dozens of different languages: Akkadian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Persian, Egyptian, and many others. To Jews who had previously lived in the relatively homogeneous Kingdom of Judah, this linguistic complexity would have been striking and perhaps unsettling. The Tower of Babel story also reflects broader ancient Near Eastern themes about the relationship between divine and human authority. Similar stories appear in various forms throughout Mesopotamian literature, often featuring gods who become concerned about human achievements and take action to limit mortal ambitions. The biblical account adapts these themes to monotheistic theology while addressing specific concerns about Babylonian religious practices. During the Babylonian captivity, which lasted from 586 to 538 BC, Jewish religious leaders developed much of the theological framework that would shape later Judaism and, through Jewish influence, Christianity and Islam. The experience of living in Babylon, seeing its magnificent achievements while maintaining their own religious identity, profoundly influenced Jewish thinking about the relationship between worldly power and spiritual authority. The Tower of Babel became a powerful symbol in this theological development. It represented the seductive appeal of human achievement divorced from proper relationship with God. The story warned against the temptation to seek security through political power, military might, or technological achievement, rather than through faithful obedience to divine will. Ironically, the actual tower that inspired this cautionary tale was destroyed not by divine intervention, but by the very human forces of political change. When the Persian Empire conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, the new rulers showed little interest in maintaining the expensive religious establishments of their predecessors. The great ziggurat fell into disrepair and was gradually dismantled, its bricks used for other construction projects throughout the region. By the time Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in 331 BCE, the tower was already largely ruined. Alexander reportedly planned to rebuild it as one of his grand projects for unifying East and West, but his death ended these ambitious plans. Subsequent rulers showed even less interest in Mesopotamian religious traditions, and the site was eventually abandoned entirely. The physical Tower of Babel disappeared from history, but its symbolic power only grew stronger. Early Christian writers used the story to illustrate themes about human pride and divine judgment. Medieval theologians saw in it lessons about the proper relationship between earthly and heavenly authority. Renaissance artists depicted it as the ultimate symbol of architectural ambition and divine retribution. Today, the Tower of Babel remains one of the most powerful symbols in Western culture, representing humanity's eternal struggle between ambition and humility, between the desire to achieve greatness and the need to maintain proper perspective about our place in the cosmic order. Whether we interpret the story literally or metaphorically, it continues to speak to fundamental questions about the relationship between human achievement and spiritual authority. The great ziggurat of Babylon may be gone, but the questions it raises about power, pride, and divine judgment remain as relevant today as they were 500 years ago, when Jewish exiles first gazed up at its painted levels rising toward the heavens. Chapter 10. The weakness of successors. When the great Nebuchadnezzar II died in 562 BCE, after ruling for 43 magnificent years, he left behind an empire that seemed invincible. His magnificent city of Babylon was the wonder of the ancient world. His armies had conquered kingdoms from Egypt to Iran, and his treasury overflowed with the tribute of dozens of subject nations. Yet within just 23 years, this mighty empire would collapse so completely that it would seem to disappear from history almost overnight. You can imagine the challenges facing any ruler who inherited such an overwhelming legacy. How do you follow a king who built the Hanging Gardens, completed the Tower of Babel, and made Babylon synonymous with power and magnificence throughout the known world? How do you maintain an empire that was held together as much by respect for Nebuchadnezzar as personal authority, as by military force or administrative efficiency? The first to face these daunting questions was Nebuchadnezzar's son, Marduk, who ascended to the throne in 562 BCE amid high hopes that he would continue his father's glorious reign. The new king inherited tremendous advantages: a powerful military machine, a sophisticated administrative system, enormous wealth, and the prestige of the most famous royal name in the ancient world. Yet from the beginning, It became clear that Marduk lacked his father's extraordinary combination of political skill, military genius, and cultural vision. Ancient sources describe him as a ruler more interested in personal pleasure than the demanding work of imperial administration. While his father had personally supervised every major decision of government, Marduk delegated authority to courtiers who often pursued their own interests rather than those of the empire. The new king's reign lasted only 2 years, ending in 560 BCE when he was assassinated in a palace coup led by his brother-in-law, Neriglissar. This violent transfer of power marked the beginning of a period of instability that would plague the empire for the remainder of its existence. The ease with which Marduk was overthrown demonstrated that Nebuchadnezzar's death had left a power vacuum that none of his successors could adequately fill. Neriglissar, who ruled from 560 to 556 BCE, proved more capable than his predecessor, but faced challenges that went far beyond personal competence. The empire's very success had created problems that traditional Mesopotamian political systems were ill-equipped to handle. The vast territories that Nebuchadnezzar had conquered required constant attention and resources to maintain, while the diverse populations of the empire had never developed strong loyalty to Babylonian rule. The economic foundation of the empire was also less stable than it appeared. Much of Babylon's wealth came from tribute and trade revenues that depended on continued political stability and military dominance. When subject kingdoms began to sense weakness at the center, they naturally started considering whether they might be better off as independent states or as allies of other rising powers. During Neriglissar's reign, these underlying problems began to manifest themselves in ways that would have been unthinkable during Nebuchadnezzar's lifetime. Provincial governors began acting with increasing independence, making local decisions without consulting Babylon and keeping larger shares of tax revenues for their own use. Some subject kingdoms stopped sending their annual tribute, testing whether the empire still possessed the will and capability to enforce its demands. More ominously, new powers were emerging on the empire's borders that possessed both the ambition and the capability to challenge Babylonian hegemony. The most significant of these was the Persian Empire under Cyrus II, known to history as Cyrus the Great. This remarkable ruler had united the Persian and Median kingdoms into a single state that controlled much of modern Iran and was rapidly expanding in all directions. When Neriglissar died in 556 BCE, the throne passed to his son Labashi Marduk, who was still a child. This created a regency situation that further weakened royal authority and encouraged ambitious nobles to pursue their own political agendas. The young king's reign lasted only a few months before he too was assassinated, this time by supporters of Nabonidus, a member of the royal family who claimed a stronger right to the throne. Nabonidus, who ruled from 556 to 539 BCE, was perhaps the most controversial and enigmatic of all the Neo-Babylonian kings. A learned man with deep interests in archaeology and ancient history, he possessed intellectual capabilities that in different circumstances might have made him a great ruler. Unfortunately for the empire, his scholarly interests often distracted him from the practical demands of imperial administration. The new king's most fateful decision was to spend much of his reign away from Babylon, campaigning in the Arabian Peninsula and establishing a secondary capital at Tiamat, an oasis city far from the traditional centers of Mesopotamian power. This absence from the imperial capital had profound political and religious consequences that would ultimately prove fatal to the empire. In Nabonidus' absence, actual power in Babylon was exercised by his son Belshazzar, who served as regent but lacked the formal authority necessary to make crucial decisions. This division of authority created confusion about who was actually in charge and made it difficult for the empire to respond effectively to emerging threats. Even more problematic was Nabonidus' apparent neglect of traditional Babylonian religious practices. The king's archaeological interests led him to favor ancient Mesopotamian deities, particularly the moon god Sin, over Marduk, the patron god of Babylon. This religious policy alienated the powerful Babylonian priesthood, which had always been crucial to royal legitimacy. The annual New Year festival, which required the king's personal participation in sacred rituals that renewed the cosmic order and legitimized royal authority, was disrupted for several years during Nabonidus' absence. To the deeply religious people of Mesopotamia, this suggested that the gods no longer favored the Babylonian royal house, a perception that would prove crucial when external enemies began threatening the empire. Meanwhile, Cyrus the Great was systematically expanding Persian power throughout the ancient Near East. His conquest of Lydia in 546 BCE brought Persian forces to the borders of the Greek world, while his control over much of Central Asia secured the valuable trade routes that connected East and West. Most ominously for Babylon, Cyrus had begun portraying himself as a liberator who would restore proper religious practices and just government to oppressed peoples. The Persian king's propaganda was specifically designed to appeal to discontented elements within the Babylonian Empire. He promised to respect local religious traditions, restore displaced peoples to their homelands, and govern according to traditional laws and customs. For subject populations who had grown tired of Babylonian rule, and for Babylonian nobles who had lost confidence in their own government, these promises offered an attractive alternative to the status quo. The military balance was also shifting in favor of the Persians. While the Babylonian army remained formidable, it was designed primarily for defensive warfare within the Mesopotamian heartland. The Persians, by contrast, had developed mobile forces capable of rapid movement across vast distances and had mastered siege techniques that could reduce even the strongest fortifications. More importantly, the Persians possessed superior intelligence networks and diplomatic capabilities that allowed them to coordinate with internal opponents of Babylonian rule. Cyrus's agents worked throughout the empire, identifying discontented nobles, alienated priests, and oppressed populations who might welcome Persian liberation. By 540 BCE, it had become clear to most observers that a confrontation between Babylon and Persia was inevitable. The two empires controlled adjacent territories, pursued conflicting policies towards subject populations, and represented fundamentally different approaches to imperial governance. War was not just likely, it was necessary to determine which system would dominate the ancient world. When that war finally came in 539 BCE, the outcome would surprise no one who had been paying attention to the internal decay of the Babylonian Empire. The military campaigns would be brief and decisive, but the real battle had already been lost in the palaces and temples of Babylon itself, where a dynasty that had once seemed destined to rule forever had gradually forfeited the loyalty and confidence of its own people. The greatest empire in the ancient world was about to fall not because of external conquest alone, but because it had lost the internal cohesion that had made it great. Chapter 11. The fall to Cyrus. The year is 539 BCE, and along the banks of the Euphrates River, two of history's most consequential armies are preparing for a confrontation that will reshape the ancient world. On one side stands the mighty Babylonian Empire, heir to 3,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization, defending walls that have never been breached by foreign enemies. On the other approaches the Persian army of Cyrus the Great, representing a new order that promises to unite East and West under a single crown. Yet this climactic battle that should have decided the fate of empires would unfold in a way that no one expected, with consequences that would echo through religious and political history for millennia to come. Picture the scene as Persian scouts first reported the massive fortifications of Babylon to their king. Rising from the Mesopotamian plain like a man-made mountain range, the city's famous double walls seemed to mock any army foolish enough to attempt a siege. Ancient sources describe these defenses as being over 300 feet high and thick enough for two 4-horse chariots to pass each other on their ramparts. The outer wall extended for more than 50 miles, protecting not just the city proper, but extensive agricultural areas that could support the population indefinitely during a siege. Within these impregnable walls lay the treasures of the ancient world. The royal palaces built by Nebuchadnezzar contained wealth beyond calculation: gold from Egypt, silver from Anatolia, precious stones from India, and artistic masterpieces from every corner of the known world. The great ziggurat of Marduk rose toward the heavens, its 7 levels painted in colors that caught the morning sun like a divine beacon. The famous hanging gardens cascaded with exotic plants and flowing water that defied the desert climate. But the most valuable treasure within Babylon's walls was something that couldn't be weighed or counted: the accumulated knowledge of human civilization. The royal libraries contained hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets recording everything from epic literature and historical chronicles to mathematical treatises and astronomical observations. These archives represented the intellectual heritage of the entire ancient Near East, preserved and expanded by generations of scholars. Cyrus understood that taking such a city by conventional siege would be impossible. Even if Persian forces could somehow breach the walls, the resulting battle would destroy the very prizes that make conquest worthwhile. The Persian king needed a different approach, one that would allow him to gain control of Babylon without destroying what made it valuable. The solution came from an unexpected source: widespread discontent within the Babylonian Empire itself. Years of misrule under Nabonidus had alienated crucial elements of Babylonian society, particularly the powerful priesthood of Marduk. The king's prolonged absences from the capital, his neglect of traditional religious ceremonies, and his apparent preference for other deities had convinced many that the gods no longer favored the royal house. Cyrus's agents had been working throughout the empire for years, identifying discontented nobles, frustrated administrators, and alienated religious leaders who might be willing to support a change of regime. These conspirators didn't necessarily prefer Persian rule, but they had lost confidence in the current system and were open to alternatives that might restore effective governance. The Persian king also possessed a powerful ideological weapon in his approach to conquered peoples. Unlike previous empires that had ruled through fear and cultural suppression, Cyrus presented himself as a liberator who would restore traditional practices and respect local customs. His famous cylinder, inscribed on clay and distributed throughout his empire, promised to return displaced peoples to their homelands, restore damaged temples, and govern according to established laws rather than arbitrary royal will. This propaganda was specifically designed to appeal to the many ethnic and religious groups within the Babylonian Empire who had grievances against the current government. Jewish exiles dreamed of returning to Jerusalem and rebuilding their temple. Mesopotamian priests wanted restoration of traditional religious practices. Provincial populations sought relief from heavy taxation and military conscription. When Cyrus finally moved against Babylon in 539 BCE, his campaign unfolded with shocking speed. Rather than attacking the city's impregnable walls, Persian forces struck at the empire's economic and communications infrastructure. Key bridges were seized, supply lines were cut, and provincial governors found themselves isolated from central command. Most crucially, Cyrus gained control of the Euphrates River upstream from Babylon. According to ancient sources, Persian engineers diverted the river into a natural depression, dramatically lowering the water level and exposing the riverbed that ran beneath the city's walls. This engineering feat created a pathway into the heart of the city that bypassed its famous fortifications entirely. But the most remarkable aspect of Babylon's fall was not the military engineering that made it possible. It was the lack of resistance that the invaders encountered. As Persian forces entered the city through the exposed riverbed, they found that key gates had been opened from within, and that much of the population welcomed them as liberators rather than conquerors. The role of internal collaboration in Babylon's fall cannot be overstated. Cyrus had convinced influential Babylonians that Persian rule would be preferable to the continuation of Nabonidus's reign. Priests who had been alienated by the king's religious policies, nobles who had been excluded from power, and administrators who had grown frustrated with governmental dysfunction all played roles in facilitating the Persian conquest. Belshazzar, who was serving as regent in his father's absence, died defending the palace, but his resistance was largely symbolic. The real decision about Babylon's fate had already been made in the temples and noble houses where influential citizens had concluded that change was necessary and inevitable. When Nabonidus himself was captured shortly afterward, the last independent Babylonian empire came to an end. The dynasty that had begun with such promise under Nabopolassar reached magnificent heights under Nebuchadnezzar II, and created some of humanity's most enduring monuments, had ruled for less than a century before, falling to forces it could no longer effectively resist. Yet Cyrus's treatment of conquered Babylon demonstrated the wisdom of his imperial philosophy. Rather than destroying the city or humiliating its people, he presented himself as the legitimate successor to the Babylonian kings and the divinely chosen protector of Mesopotamian civilization. The famous Cyrus cylinder, discovered by archaeologists in 1879, records his proclamation. "When I enter Babylon as a friend, and when I establish the seat of the government in the palace of the ruler under jubilation, and, rejoicing, Marduk, the great lord, induced the magnanimous inhabitants of Babylon to love me." This approach proved remarkably successful. Babylon continued to flourish under Persian rule, maintaining its position as one of the empire's most important cities. The great monuments built by Nebuchadnezzar were preserved and maintained. The libraries and schools continued their scholarly work, often with Persian royal support. Many Babylonian nobles and administrators found positions in the new imperial government, bringing their expertise to the service of their Persian masters. For the Jewish exiles, Persian conquest brought the fulfillment of prophetic promises that seemed too good to be true. Cyrus's edict permitting their return to Jerusalem, and the rebuilding of their temple was seen as divine intervention in human history. The Persian king was actually called a Messiah, an anointed one in the Hebrew Bible, the only non-Jewish ruler ever to receive this honor. The fall of Babylon marked more than the end of a particular empire. It represented a fundamental transformation in how power was conceived and exercised in the ancient world. The Persian Empire that Cyrus created would become the largest and most diverse political entity in human history up to that time, encompassing territories from India to Egypt and from Central Asia to the Aegean Sea. This new imperial model, based on cultural tolerance and administrative efficiency rather than military intimidation, would influence political development for centuries. The Romans would adapt Persian administrative techniques to their own empire building. Islamic empires would draw inspiration from Persian models of governing diverse populations. Even modern concepts of federalism and cultural autonomy can trace their ancestry to innovations pioneered by Cyrus and his successors. The Babylonian Empire was dead, but Babylon itself would continue as an important city for centuries to come. Alexander the Great would make it one of his capitals. The Seleucid kings would maintain it as a major administrative center. Only gradually, as new cities rose and trade routes shifted, would the great metropolis finally decline into the ruins that modern archaeologists have excavated. The lost kingdom of Babylon had ended not with a bang but with a whimper, conquered less by foreign armies than by internal decay and the appeal of new ideas about how empires should be governed. Yet its cultural legacy would prove more durable than any political structure, influencing law, literature, religion, and science for thousands of years to come. In the immediate aftermath of Cyrus's conquest, Babylon underwent a transformation that was both dramatic and surprisingly gentle. Unlike the brutal sacks that had characterized previous changes of power in Mesopotamian history, The Persian takeover was managed with a sophistication that reflected Cyrus's revolutionary approach to imperial governance. The great king understood that Babylon's value lay not in its destruction, but in its preservation as a functioning center of administration, culture, and commerce. You can imagine the complex emotions that gripped Babylon's inhabitants during those first months of Persian rule. The city that had dominated the ancient world for over a century was now a provincial capital in an even larger empire. Yet for many Babylonians, this change brought unexpected benefits. The chaos and uncertainty that had characterized Nabonidus's final years gave way to efficient administration and clear policies. Trade routes that had been disrupted by political instability were restored and protected by Persian military power. Cyrus's treatment of Babylon's religious establishments demonstrated his genius for imperial management. Rather than imposing Persian religious practices, he embraced the role of patron to Mesopotamian temples and positioned himself as the legitimate successor to the Babylonian kings in their sacred duties. The annual New Year festival, which had been disrupted during Nabonidus's absences, was restored with full ceremony, with Cyrus himself participating in the rituals that legitimized royal authority. This religious policy had profound political implications. By respecting and supporting traditional Mesopotamian religious practices, Cyrus gained the crucial backing of the priestly classes who had been alienated by Nabonidus's innovations. These priests, who controlled vast economic resources and wielded enormous influence over the population, became active supporters of Persian rule rather than centers of resistance. The economic integration of Babylon into the Persian Empire brought both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, the city gained access to trade networks that stretched from India to Egypt, bringing exotic goods and new commercial opportunities. Persian royal roads, protected by military garrisons and maintained by imperial engineers, made long-distance trade safer and more profitable than it had ever been. Babylonian merchants found new markets for their products, while gaining access to raw materials and manufactured goods from across the known world. However, this integration also meant that Babylon was no longer the economic center of its own independent empire. Tax revenues that had once flowed into Babylonian treasuries now went to support Persian imperial administration. While the city remained wealthy and important, it was wealth in service to a larger system rather than for its own independent purposes. The intellectual and cultural life of Babylon flourished under Persian rule in ways that surprised many observers. The new imperial administration needed skilled bureaucrats who understood local conditions and could manage the complex social and economic relationships that sustained Mesopotamian civilization. Many Babylonian nobles, priests, and scribes found positions in the Persian imperial government, often advancing to high levels of responsibility. This created a fascinating cultural synthesis where Babylonian administrative techniques and intellectual traditions influenced Persian imperial practice throughout the empire. The cuneiform writing system continued to be used for official documents in Mesopotamia. Babylonian mathematical and astronomical knowledge was incorporated into Persian royal education. Legal traditions that trace back to Hammurabi's code influenced Persian approaches to provincial administration. For the Jewish exiles, the Persian conquest fulfilled prophetic promises in ways that seemed almost miraculous. Cyrus's edict permitting their return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of their temple represented a complete reversal of the policies that had brought them to Babylon in the first place. Yet ironically, many Jews chose to remain in Babylon rather than return to their ancestral homeland. The community that had been established during the exile had put down deep roots and developed its own institutions and traditions. The Jewish community that remained in Babylon would become one of the most important centers of Jewish learning and culture for over 1,000 years. The great academies of Sura and Pumbedita would produce the Babylonian Talmud, one of Judaism's most important sacred texts. This community's influence on Jewish religious development was so profound that Babylonian became synonymous with a particular approach to Jewish scholarship and religious practice. The Persian period also saw important developments in Babylonian intellectual life. Freed from the need to serve purely Babylonian imperial purposes, scholars could pursue knowledge for its own sake while contributing to the broader cultural project of Persian imperial synthesis. Astronomical observations became more systematic and mathematical, leading to discoveries that would eventually influence Greek and Islamic science. Literary works began incorporating themes and stories from across the Persian Empire, creating new forms of cross-cultural narrative. The gradual decline of cuneiform writing during this period marked the end of an era that had lasted for over 3 millennia. As Aramaic became the common language of imperial administration and commerce throughout the Persian Empire, the complex cuneiform system gradually became obsolete except for specialized religious and scholarly purposes. This transition represented more than a change in writing systems. It symbolized the end of Mesopotamian cultural isolation and the beginning of its integration into a truly international civilization. The architectural heritage of Babylon also underwent significant changes during the Persian period. While the great monuments built by Nebuchadnezzar were maintained and respected, new construction reflected Persian architectural influences and imperial themes. The result was a unique synthesis that preserved Babylonian artistic traditions while incorporating new elements from across the Persian Empire. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in 331 BCE, he found Babylon still functioning as an important administrative and cultural center. Alexander's plan to make Babylon one of his capital cities demonstrated the city's continued importance. Even though this vision died with the great conqueror in 323 BC, subsequent Hellenistic rulers continued to maintain Babylon as a major city, though its political importance gradually declined as new centers of power emerged. The story of Babylon under Persian rule illustrates one of history's most successful examples of cultural preservation through political transformation. Rather than being destroyed by conquest, Babylonian civilization was preserved and transformed, allowing its contributions to human knowledge and culture to survive and influence future generations. This legacy would prove more durable than any political structure, continuing to shape human thought and achievement long after the last Persian king had fallen to Macedonian spears. The lost kingdom had found new life through losing its independence, demonstrating that sometimes the greatest victories come through accepting transformation rather than resisting inevitable change. As we reach the end of our journey through the epic history of Babylon, we're left with a profound question. What does it mean for a kingdom to be truly lost? The Babylonian Empire that fell to Cyrus in 539 BC was indeed destroyed as a political entity, its kings dethroned and its independence extinguished forever. Yet, in another sense, Babylon was never lost at all. It simply transformed from a physical reality into something far more powerful and enduring, an eternal symbol in human consciousness. The legacy of the lost kingdom of Babylon touches virtually every aspect of modern civilization. When we speak of legal justice, we invoke principles first codified in Hammurabi's code. When we measure time in hours and minutes, we use the base 60 mathematical system developed by Babylonian astronomers. When we read the Bible, we encounter stories deeply influenced by the Jewish experience of exile in Babylon, from the Tower of Babel to the prophecies of Daniel. The very word Babylon has transcended its historical origins to become a universal symbol of power, magnificence, and complexity. In literature, from the Book of Revelation to modern novels, Babylon represents the heights of human achievement and the depths of moral corruption. In politics, it symbolizes both imperial ambition and ultimate fragility. In popular culture, it evokes images of ancient wisdom and mysterious grandeur. Perhaps most remarkably, The story of Babylon's rise and fall provides timeless lessons about the nature of power itself. Hammurabi's insight that lasting authority must be based on justice, not just force, remains as relevant today as it was 3,800 years ago. Nebuchadnezzar's understanding that cultural achievement can outlast military conquest has been proven by history itself. The final lesson of Cyrus's conquest, that empires fall not when they are defeated by stronger enemies, but when they lose the loyalty of their own people, continues to echo in our contemporary world. Today, as we face our own challenges of global governance, cultural diversity, and technological change, the lost kingdom of Babylon offers both inspiration and warning. It reminds us that human achievement can reach extraordinary heights, but also that no earthly power lasts forever. Most importantly, it teaches us that our greatest creations are laws. Our knowledge, our stories, and our dreams can survive the rise and fall of empires to enrich and guide future generations. In this sense, Babylon is not lost at all. It lives on wherever humans strive for justice, seek knowledge, create beauty, or dare to build something greater than themselves. The kingdom may be gone, but its spirit endures forever.